the customer success team needs to know we're going to sell to stretch fit customers, but that doesn't mean recklessly. That means we're going to be careful, deliberate, and strategic about like, okay, we are expanding into this new market. Here's what that new market entails. These will be stretch fit customers. They will churn at a higher rate. It may not be pleasant, but we're going to have to do that for the growth of the company. That's the proper way to do it, I think.
What's up, lifers, and welcome to the Daily Standup with Lifetime Value, where we're giving you fresh new customer success ideas every single day. You know what? Maybe I shouldn't have even said customer success, because today we're going to be talking about something else. I've got my man Rob with me. Rob, can you say hi?
What's up, lifers?
Rob, you're the only person here. You and me. I am your host, Dillon Young. Nobody else wanted to join us. But I think you brought something to the table today that is quite curious, maybe incendiary to some of our colleagues. Do you want to talk about it?
We're talking about how HubSpot fixed retention, aren't we?
Yeah, they solved it.
Yep. How HubSpot, quote unquote, fixed retention. And I can't bring this topic up without thanking a friend of the show, Bob London, for putting it on our radar. Mm-hmm. Bob shared this with me. There's an article that goes through tons of steps and strategies that HubSpot put in place to deal with the fact that their retention rates were around 60%, 60% gross, 63% net back in 2010. So they were bringing customers in, no problem, but that leaky bucket was leaking. And So the interesting thing, and eventually I'll tell you why Bob put this on our plate. Bob has a special tendency to be able to sort of hear the dog that doesn't bark and notice the things that are missing. But there's a lot of really good pieces of this article. Should I just give a quick summary on the article?
Yeah, go ahead.
So the article goes through quite a few strategies that the CEO, I believe is the CEO of HubSpot, went through, starting with revisiting leadership metrics in meetings, then moving to changing sales incentives, investing in an account management function, which we'll come back to, pivoting the product strategy. That was another piece around do we focus on more of a top of funnel product or more of a middle of funnel product based on the voice of the customer? Also rebalancing spend toward R&D. I thought that was interesting. And then the last thing he mentions is evolving pricing. And so basically the long and short of it is that they go from about 60% gross retention to 89%, and they got their net retention from 63 to 103% net retention, which I think most people listening to this, like best in class is often revered as like 120%, but not always so attainable. But regardless, massive improvements for HubSpot. I'll pause there because I just summarized all the changes that they went through. We can comment on those changes, but do you notice there was a department that wasn't mentioned?
Yeah, I stepped on your toes to start this off because I knew this. I've seen the Bob London post, love Bob London, that said there's no mention of customer success.
There's no mention of customers in theory, but not as a department.
Well, fine.
Which is interesting, right? I mean, look, they talk about building an account management function, but that, is not really like a function in this example that was meant to drive customer value outcomes. The value outcomes are just a means to a broader end of some company financial metrics. So it's interesting, right?
Can I challenge this first, Rob? So first of all, he starts this, I think the original article talks about how they had this revelation, him and his co-founder, back in like 2008, something like that. First of all, I didn't realize HubSpot was that old, but I see 2010 is the 60% gross and 63% net retention figures. So I don't know if that's the same time that they realized that this was a problem. And notice that that's only 5 or 6 years after Salesforce, quote unquote, invented customer success. But it was not likely a universal term yet. So this guy was born and raised in a time where customer success didn't exist. So I'm not surprised that he doesn't mention it, but talks about the many responsibilities that it has had. Anyway, keep going.
Yeah. Well, so I think that's a good point. I mean, there's this like conversation we've been having for a long time. Like, is customer success a department or is it a strategy? Is it a philosophy? Is it an outcome? And the same thing happens now. It's happening in digital customer success. Like, is digital a segment or is it? And like, you know what? It doesn't really matter. That's not the central topic of conversation to be had. It's a good clarifying question about the lens through which we're viewing the topic. But the point is, we have to assume, at least in this case, that they were improving their metrics by making their customers more successful. Like when they talk about changing their product strategy from a top of funnel focus to a middle of funnel focus, that sounds like a voice of the customer program at play. It sounds like a customer success oriented motion. Whether or not there's a department that's getting their butts kicked by customers day to day and managing onboarding and managing renewals and all that stuff. You know, I'm sure they were doing all of this stuff. It was just housed in different places. So we could look at like the different, pieces of this that I think are relevant.
Like, what is the most interesting piece of this article to you? Like, was there anything in here that you're like, holy cannoli, I didn't even think about that, or like that was really forward thinking for that time?
So in my usual fashion, I'll give a couple of runners up. As I skim this article, there's a couple of things that I think stood out. I think first of all, like, they introduced customer NPS at a time when it was not probably such a hated metric. Now it's so controversial, but it's interesting because for them, that was like epic. Like, oh my God, we're surveying our customers for satisfaction. That was cool. I think when they talk about the marketing, the way that marketing was involved with resolving the retention issues, they talk about refining their personas and their ICP. And I hear a little bit of what Cheryl Hawk talked about months ago about how persona and ICP are not the same. As I skim through a little bit more, I see them talking about their financial metrics that they care about. Like they're talking about what should be our God metric, whether it's like NRR or, and I remember this is a conversation we've had with a lot of guests, like, Tim, who was on the show before. But I think the most interesting one is probably the finding that what they call is creating like different axes of revenue from the customer base. And that the more they could sell to a customer, the stickier those customers became, which I think a lot of us have seen in practice. But it's interesting to hear from a more horizontal SaaS company like HubSpot, as opposed to your typical vertical SaaS company where the entire business model is based on monetizing every sub-vertical for your client. So long story short, you upsell more, you retain more is I think the main point there that I think was most interesting.
Yeah.
I've seen that in practice, but yeah, what about you?
I think what's most interesting to me is that this was written in November of 2024. Mm-hmm. And the revelations feel like things we've talked about for a long time. Mm-hmm. I don't mean that to sound condescending in any way. What I mean is it's funny, I guess, that he talks about these revelations around things that an entire company should care about, that in other, maybe less mature companies think all belong in customer success, customer advocacy, or how about how blasphemous some founders think the idea of a clawback is in commissions. How people look, HubSpot was conceivably at least a couple of years old at this point, when they instituted a clawback at the 7-month mark. I don't know how many founders I've suggested something similar to who just scoff at me and pat me on the head like I'm a silly little boy, or tell me that it is just too complicated and they'll never do it. And a company worth more than them did it to great effect.
Yeah. This always comes up. Every time I do a training on sales handoffs, the topic of clawback comes up, and CS people are like beating on the table, like, we need that. Yeah, give us that. And like, that's usually the extent of the conversation before the executive team says, yeah, well, that's cute. We're not going to do that.
But that goes to, I think that we're kind of like swirling in this larger conversation of like, that's CS not having the respect it deserves. Right.
Well, maybe. So I view SaaS through a consequentialist framework, where it's like, what are the consequences we're dealing with here? And sorry, I frameworked it.
Oh man, always be frameworking.
Yeah, exactly. And so there could be a world where a clawback protocol just doesn't make sense in that framework. Right? Maybe you're willing to deal with your stretch fit customers. I don't think so. And maybe you're not willing to compromise sales velocity. No. And that doesn't mean respect. No. That might not mean respect.
No. There is always room for it because there are always bad fit customers. Sure. The share of them that end up in a clawback protocol, maybe it's way lower. But totally. I think there are always rules around you can't sell contracts. Period. And there will be repercussions if you do so. And I have been in half a dozen companies where it walks through the door every day and they don't do a thing about it. So no, it is not. It is never not applicable. It is just sometimes not as often applicable as other scenarios.
Well, I think we're bringing a good topic up here, which is that it's a spectrum. The spectrum of fit. Yeah. It's not as black and white as poor fit, good fit.
Yeah.
There's stretch fit customers. And one of the hard positions I've been in working with a lot of early stage companies is the customer success team needs to know we're going to sell to stretch fit customers, but that doesn't mean recklessly. That means we're going to be careful, deliberate, and strategic about like, okay, we are expanding into this new market. Here's what that new market entails. These will be stretch fit customers. They will churn at a higher rate. It may not be pleasant, but we're going to have to do that for the growth of the company. That's the proper way to do it, I think, with the buy-in of the customer success team and clear criteria. Yeah. And having that's where respect can come in, is like customer success having a seat at that table of expanding to new verticals, new markets, new product lines. But when it just happens haphazardly or out of desperation, then you're playing a nasty game.
Friend of the show, David Karp, said something to me off of recording one time that was basically like, he said it so confidently, and David is a very nice man. He said, if sales stops selling, you stop working effectively. Again, that is definitive in a world that is more gray, but the idea was they've got to continue to sell and allow them to iterate and refine that ICP. But if you tomorrow tell them you can't sell to this half of the TAM that we've identified, like that has downstream impacts that I don't think CS always thinks about.
Or even has informational access to.
Correct. Anyway, Rob, that's our time. I love it. We'll link to the post in the show notes so people have access to it and they can make their own determinations and DM us on LinkedIn. Tell us what you think and whether you think my rant was warranted or not.
I think it was spiritually needed. Peace.
You've been listening to the Daily Standup by Lifetime Value. Please note that the views expressed in these conversations are attributed only to those individuals on this recording and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of their respective employers. For all inquiries, please reach out via email to Dillon at lifetimevaluemedia.com. Find us on YouTube at Lifetime Value, and find us on the socials at Lifetime Value Media. Until next time.